if I have to pick a side, I'm on the side of someone who's making sense, right? And the moment a person of my religion or my skin color or my political party stops making sense, I'm on the side of the person of whatever skin color or whatever religion or whatever political party who points that out, because error is the problem. Dishonesty is the problem. Confirmation bias is the problem. Delusion is the problem. And I just see pegging anything of real substance to identity is a kind of anchor to delusion, or it's a kind of machinery for producing delusion, or at least self-deception in the future, in the most benign case. And I think the analogy you drew to saving your drowning mother as opposed to my drowning mother, I mean, those are the kinds of examples that while understandable, I mean, you would think there's something wrong with you if you were, as someone like the Dalai Lama professes to be, indifferent to who you save because all beings are equally ends in themselves. There's something about that ethics that we can't totally embrace and feel good about ourselves, at least most of us. But those are precisely the cases of bias that can't be mapped on to society at large, and we constantly correct for them with our institutions and our laws, and we feel, not only do we feel good about doing that, we see that's the only way to go. So, I mean, the example I've given on this topic before, when I've spoken about the ethics here, is that obviously I'm partial to my child and most concerned about my child's health. And, there's lots of sick children in the world who I don't spend much time thinking about, but the moment my child gets sick, it consumes my day. So when I show up at the hospital with my child and something's really wrong, I want to be seen as quickly as possible. But I don't actually want a hospital that is unfair. I want some process of triage going on in a hospital that I know will occasionally work to my disadvantage and the disadvantage of my child. But I just know that given everyone's competing interests and given the fact that somebody richer than me is going to show up at the hospital sometime when I'm there, a fair system is the only system that is, in fact, ethical. And I think that gets us out of identity the moment you have to map it on to society at large.
Well, it seems to me you're leaving out, really, human imperfection and the imperfection of institutions. Most hospitals, it's not a question of them having their ideas wrong about who should be treated. It's that they don't have enough resources, they don't have enough time. And if you're in an emergency room, I've spent a lot of time in emergency rooms with family members that I've had to defend. You'd better be an advocate, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because you're in a you might say non-optimal ethical situation, and all of life is non-optimal. And so,
but let's just focus on that a little bit more, because so if I'm in the emergency room with my daughter who's been injured. Let's say she's got a broken arm, or what I think is a broken arm, and I see the circumstance exactly as you describe, which is one of limitation and imperfection, and therefore triage. And I'm, obviously incredibly impatient to get my daughter seen. She's extremely uncomfortable. I'm advocating for her at the desk, and the nurse or doctor looks at me and says, "We'll see her exactly as soon as we can. This patient over here is before you, and this patient is going into cardiac arrest," right? That is an argument. The answer to that from me, if I'm an ethical, sane human being, isn't, "Fuck you, my daughter is the most important child on earth."
But what if there are two children? They can only have one child. In terms of triage, there's no difference between the two of them. You're not going to advocate for your child?
If you push me truly into extremis, and these are both we truly have an emergency on our hands, and one child is essentially going to die, well, then I can't really attest to how sane I will be. But I'll tell you who I think I should be in those moments is someone who doesn't lose his awareness of the fact that other people are just as important to themselves and their children are just as important to them as I am to myself and my child is to me. And that there is a stepping out of oneself. There is a kind of view from nowhere that is a norm, that is, again, something that we lose sight of. But when we're making laws and building institutions and designing our society, that's precisely what we try to hold on to.
That was an excerpt from the most recent version of Sam Harris's podcast, Waking Up, where he was talking to the political scientist Mark Lilla about various issues, and they got in conversation about identity, and they disagree about this and what have you. And it's a decent example of Sam Harris in an intellectual sense, in sense of being correct, technically correct. And as I navigate my way through this video, I will be addressing a very thorny issue that afflicts just about every human being on the planet, namely what I call the non-transferable technically correct. Now, Sam Harris is, despite what he believes, biased. We all are biased. And for example, his rather gaudy obsession with women, his gynocentrism, is through the roof. And that might just be the case because it's never been pointed out to him. For example, when he talks about the suffering of women, it's never mentioned that men are suffering as well. I do believe, at least in his own mind, he is an ethical person, or strives to be one. And that excerpt is a good example of his worldview and how things ought to operate within that. Now, I also want to tie in a gentleman many of you might know, Mouthy Buddha. Now, I've invited Mouthy Buddha on a few times to talk. He has respectfully declined for whatever reasons. I don't really quite comprehend them, but I will address some issues he's brought up in the past and some shortcomings there, as well as shortcomings on my part, at least in the past. Now, when I talk about the non-transferable, technically correct, I'm talking about essentially what Sam Harris was arguing there. I don't think you can really find fault with his argument. And I didn't want to let the excerpt run too long, but Mark Lilla responds correctly, saying, well, people aren't motivated by reason, they're motivated by emotion. I mean, I'm sort of cutting down the argument to its constituent bits, but it's basically what it's saying. He says, paraphrasing, people aren't motivated by reason to do the right thing. We want them to take action to do the right thing, but not do the right thing based merely on the ethical propositions associated with doing the right thing. But this all goes back, and this is in the realm of ethics, but this goes back to a much greater issue. Issues of, I don't like the term metaphysics, but it's almost impossible to evade here, sort of metaphysics and one's perception of the world. And here I invoke one Mouthy Buddha. Many of you might know him. He has produced some fairly controversial videos. They shouldn't be, but regardless. And I recall one video a while back where he was making arguments for the insubstantive nature of the self, a lack of identity, that identity is an illusion. This is something that Sam Harris has argued, and it's actually technically correct. There is no identity when scrutinized under the lens of scientific investigation. Neurology, for example, real neuroscience, will quickly disabuse a person, if that person is investigated sufficiently, of the notion of a permanent fixed self, and for that matter, free will, which I'll get in a bit. Even physics, I would argue, will do similar things. But this notion of a continuous self that has a beginning point and then a terminus, and that all the cells, if you want to call them that, contained within that continuous self are contiguous to each other, as well as being continuous, that is a very powerful felt emotion. It is a feeling, but it doesn't actually map onto reality. And if you've engaged in meditation, I'd argue you don't even need to, that sense of a self that is you, a perpetual or continuous I, is not really there. But everyone has that gut feeling, and when we go about our business on a daily basis, that is true too. And that feeling persists for the vast majority of the people. Most people aren't going to get it. And I saw just a huge waste and squandering of time in the comment section of that video, where he's arguing back and forth about this sort of illusion of the self. And he's right, and Sam Harris is right when he talks about it in the most technical sense. But everyone walks about the world as if there were an I. And there's a tacit assumption that there is an I. And this is an excellent example of what I would call the non-transferable technically correct, meaning that there are many details in life, in the universe, that are technically correct, that are non-transferable in a variety of ways. The biggest issue, of course, one way, is when the non-transferable technically correct is unable to reach a person, which is to say the person cannot disabuse himself of his particular worldview, despite that worldview not being technically correct, because he's operating with his primitive hardware intact and has not applied the right software programs to modulate the hardware and to perhaps circumvent it in some cases. So that's a great example, I think, of trying to convince a mass of people who have either never engaged in meditation, never thought about the question philosophically in terms of physics, neurology, in terms of just basic sort of biophysics, the notion of a continuous self. Same thing applies to free will. Although in that case, a lot of people take all kinds of weird turns and dives. I've seen people make strange arguments concerning the movement patterns of subatomic particles, as if that were an argument for free will, and all the way up to the very sort of conventional libertarian notions of free will. Well, obviously, if you take the time and you have some brain, examine the question of free will, conventional notions, and even unconventional ones, although I think conventional ones are probably the ones that crumble the fastest in light of under the rigor of scrutiny. Well, yeah, it's pretty obvious there's no such thing as free will, but we all go about pretending that there is, and even I do. If I make a mistake, say in an Overwatch game, I say it's my fault. Is it technically my fault? Well, no. There probably were there's a number of events that has led up to me making that mistake. And these events themselves were beyond my control, and so on and so forth. But we all move about with this sense of an I and a sense of quote unquote free will. It's completely illusory. It's bollocks. It's poppycock. But it doesn't really matter, because the vast majority of people are enslaved to these notions and entranced by it and enthralled. And once again, they're pretty much the same, one and the same in some sense. But free will, the continuous I, ego. The question is, what do you do about this? If these are categories, and I think the ethics mentioned by Sam Harris are probably not quite as potent, but they're a good example of something that's technically correct that maybe not everyone would necessarily assent to. What do you do about this? If something's technically correct but non-transferable for the majority of people, you are left with a massive problem. Now, I think the internet is a bit thorny here, if only because people don't argue in the comment section for the sake of reason. And we can talk more about reason generally, or to present good arguments and to be rebuked and then grateful for learning something. And sometimes you do learn stuff. But nonetheless, reason is not a powerful penetrating force for most people. And this is something I've had to struggle with for years because I try to be motivated by reason and reality, but I'm obviously only going to get through to a certain number of people in that process. So what do I do? Well, I'm left really with acknowledging a different type of reality, a reasonable reality, where reason is largely absent. And I think Sam Harris, apart from his, as I said, rather gaudy gynocentrism, is lost in his own little bubble. He's lost in many bubbles. The bubble that Charles Murray referred to, Fishtown versus Belmont, but he actually thinks more highly of people than he ought to, I think, in their capacity to absorb argument and apply argument and be convinced by compelling points of argumentation. It's just, that's not how human beings operate. I think it should be obvious to most people at this stage. And although I have been willing historically to always acknowledge that, I think this is the first time I will acknowledge that it creates a real impasse. It creates a real issue in interacting with people because, frankly speaking, you're not going to get through with them with most of these arguments. Most people don't care that the self is an illusion. I mean, I've had this argument with friends, for example, maybe it all is just a computer simulation. Maybe multiverse theory is correct and all of these things, but that doesn't do diddly squat for you in the current year, in the present moment. What is the way around this? That is the real question. The question is not how do you transfer the non-transferable to people who just are incapable of absorbing it. The question is, how do we create a space where those dedicated to reality, in its realist sense, obviously, are allowed to engage in their work and flourish? It's not too dissimilar to the notion of sort of scientific outposts that I talked about with Emil, the Danish IQ researcher. But I think there's a need for a type of person who divorces himself to the best of his ability from the overly emotional and those sort of gut feelings of, say, there's a me, there's an I, there's a self, silly notions of free will, and is allowed to operate both in terms of thought and action outside of that paradigm. The real question, once you establish that, let's say we could create some space, metaphorical or otherwise, where people can do that, is if such things should have an influence on society. Reality-based insights, observations, scientific conclusions. I think ultimately they probably should. But Mark Lilla, the political scientist that Sam Harris is arguing with, and I'll be posting links to that episode of the podcast, well, he's right. You need, once non-transferable. Somehow, the language of reality and the conclusions about reality, about human nature, these need to be parsed in a way such that the broader public can accept them on their own emotional terms and grounds. Because once again, it's non-transferable in the direct sense, right? This is the issue I think that Mouthy Buddha faced in that particular video, and as well as some other videos. This is an issue that I think Sam Harris has been historically blind to, and even to some degree I have historically been blind to, mea culpa, or not, since I'm not in charge, right? That you just, some men you just can't reach, to quote Cool Hand Luke. And so what do you do? I think the best solution to this is to at least allow for the space to be created where people can think about things in the most in-depth manner possible, availing themselves of facts and reason, divorcing themselves from emotion, effectively dehumanizing themselves, allowing themselves to recognize what is reality, what is the substrate of reality that is the I. Is there an I? Well, no, there isn't. And see if there's any positive benefit to that. Because, look, I don't fundamentally disagree with a Mouthy Buddha who says, well, and I believe that's what he was saying in that video, if we all just sort of recognize the illusory nature of the self, well, we'll get along and it's all peachy keen. But people believe that they have an identity that is fixed, that is perpetual, at least until the great beyond claims them. As I said, they believe in identity that persists through each moment, each contiguous moment, up until they pass on. And if for whatever reason, well, they're neurological reasons, they cannot grasp that is an illusion, and it is, in the technical sense, science has revealed this to be the case, well, it doesn't really matter because you need to get them on your side. I'm not going to be the person to do this, by the way. I should probably add that. I'm not the person who is going to make potent emotional arguments that can somehow be juxtaposed to reasonable arguments in order to get people to do reasonable things. That would require greater mind. For one thing, I don't think I would like myself if I did that as a person. Not that I really like myself very much to begin with, but I think that's, once again, if we actually examine ourselves, we're probably not going to like ourselves very much. I think that's a natural consequence of the examined life, but neither here nor there. But in a sort of greater sense, I wouldn't like myself. But I won't be that person for that reason. It's disingenuous, I think. So it's strange that I'm kind of endorsing a type of being disingenuous if you want to get things done in accordance with reality itself and how reality is. I don't really see any other way. I think the fruits to be had, if there are any, in the context of things like meditation and recognizing free will to be an illusion and the self that's always changing and therefore not a self, that's something that has the most benefit on a personal level for the individual. But it's not going to be of benefit to the masses. I also should add that the alt-right isn't particularly interested in subtle truths. They are the alt-right, so there you go. that comment section, that video is going to be in loss anyway in that regard. But it's just something that's been bugging me, I think, for years, and I wanted to sort of summarize my thoughts on it, that there's a need for a type of person who can communicate the reasonable, but in a way that actually penetrates the veil of the self-deceptive emotional that seems to encapsulate most of human life, and most human beings are just consumed by in every moment of their waking lives, again and again and again. Once again, I'm not going to be that person. I cannot be that person. I'm not constituted such that I can be that person. But maybe there's somebody else out there who can do that. But Mouthy Buddha's approach of sort of just directly revealing certain things, it just doesn't matter because it's non-transferable. It's technically correct. It's non-transferable. The ethical argument Sam Harris is making, yeah, these are technically correct too. I think it's more transferable than some of these other factoids, but difficult. And this is, I think, will remain a perennial problem for human beings in any advanced society because we are still operating with this primitive hardware. And what we need to do is to activate modular software that can mitigate and intervene and affect the hardware such that the hardware is pushed in a separate direction, or at least even temporarily turned off, although some hardware we definitely need. But we need modular software. The path to that modular software, creation of that modular software, Well, I think it's not going to be the same path for everyone. And that's what I'm basically arguing here. You need to recognize, even if you are one of these people who says, oh, the self's an illusion, and then observes and, yeah, that makes sense. Or, oh, that's kind of obvious. That won't be a solution for most people. And so you might have created your own software package for analysis, but the masses will need a different one. If you think that this non-transferable, technically correct, is worth spreading about. That is an open-ended question, by the way, because if you recall, in the 18th century, when deism was a real big thing, that is the idea of a god that is sort of distant and removed, a first mover. I think that's poppycock now and gobbledygook, but that was sort of sophisticated at the time amongst the intelligentsia thinkers. They just thought, well, that might all be true, but we can't let the masses know. The masses need to persist in their belief in a theistic God and what have you. It might be that the non-transferable, technically correct, will always remain a sphere of the arcane, eldritch knowledge that is beyond the pale for most people and utterly useless for most people. And the analog there, once again, is to be found in earlier Enlightenment thinkers regarding the theistic notion of a God as silly and maintaining their deism in the face of it. But for the squabbling masses, they need to believe in Jeebus. It might be that case, just as it might be the case with regards to some of these revealing truths about the nature of reality and human beings' place in it. I don't know. I don't know what the solution is, but before we close the door on the possibility entirely, we need to first and foremost acknowledge that there is a technically correct set of facts and information that is not transferable to most people, and most people don't get, and even to the extent that they do get it, don't care. Let's say tomorrow, as an example, which I've already mentioned or alluded to, it was proven in absolute terms that we're all running on a computer simulation. That's fascinating to dwell upon. And that might have consequences for the individual, but most people are just keep on trucking the way they've always been trucking, moving on. So, something to think about, something to correct in myself, or I have corrected myself. I no longer, for quite some time, believe I can reach people. And I think Mouthy Buddha would be well advised to engage in similar. I think he's young, frankly speaking, and a bit naive in this regard. And so he still has hopes of transferring the technically correct. But it is the non-transferable, technically correct for a reason. All right, I have rambled on enough for this video, I believe. I will check you out later if it's possible. The flat search continues, yada, yada, yada. If I'm still alive, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.